Blood of brothers. Pope Francis calls Libya killings a barbaric assassination of innocents who were killed merely for being Christian. Terror in Denmark. The country's prime minister downplays talk of a terror network connection to weekend shootings. Old Man Winter. Blinding snow, brutal winds, and frigid temperatures greet millions of Americans. And Holiday Tour. We take you to George Washington's home on this President's Day. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Monday, February 16th, 2015. Good evening from Washington. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Egypt launches airstrikes on the Islamic State in Libya in retaliation for the beheadings of Egyptian Christians. Jason Calvi reports.
Tears and grief in the Egyptian village where half of the victims are from. They were working in Libya, but 21 Coptic Christians were kidnapped there in December and January.
I was in a different room. In about 10 minutes, they knocked on the room next door and took those who were inside and left.
An Islamic State video shows the mass execution. Some victims cried out, "Oh God," or "Oh Jesus." An ISIS member calls the men Coptic crusaders.
A ludicrous term in itself, since we've lived through so much persecution over the past centuries, and we've never taken up arms and never dealt aggressively. 18 months ago, we had attacks on 100 of our churches and places of ministry, and there was no violent outbreak or reaction then.
The Egyptian president has declared a week of mourning, and this grieving father wants his son's body back.
I demand international community and President El-Sisi to bring back the bodies of the victims.
Today, Pope Francis denounced the slayings.
Sean católicos, ortodoxos, coptos, luteranos.
He says it makes no difference whether they're Catholics, Orthodox, Copts, or Protestants. They are Christians. Their blood is one and the same. Their blood confesses Christ. And prayers rise up for the dead inside this Egyptian village's only church. Pope Francis offered sympathy during a call today to the head of Egypt's Coptic Orthodox Church. The beheading video is called "A Message Signed with Blood to the Nation of the Cross." In it, ISIS says they will conquer Rome. Brian?
Thank you, Jason. Andrew Doran is vice president, co-founder of In Defense of Christians. Andrew, ISIS has been going after just about everybody, but it seems like Christians are really taking the brunt of their wrath. How many Christians have been killed by ISIS?
It would be difficult to have a precise number there. Certainly well into the upper hundreds, and probably much more likely well into the thousands.
In this latest video, there was even a threat that they were going to conquer Rome. Does this mean the Catholic Church needs to be aware of a possible attack?
I think this is a threat that's going to be with us for a very long time, and certainly I would think Christian religious leaders, Westerners, should be aware, and I'm certain that they are.
This is really frightening. It seems to be just blowing up, expanding. Certainly Libya is an expansion of ISIS, isn't it?
This is another example of ISIS taking the Western world by surprise, and it's another example of an al-Qaeda-affiliated extremist group trying to outflank, as it were, the previous group in terms of extremism. They've gone even a step further than ISIS has typically gone with the public execution of Christians, who are people of the book and ought to be protected even by the most rigid interpretations of the Quran.
And Pope Francis is certainly denouncing this and calling these Coptic Christians our brothers. They shed their blood. Egypt has started to do airstrikes, but when you consider the interior turmoil in Egypt, how much can they do?
Well, first of all, these migrant workers were not crusaders. They were not ideologues. They were humble workers whose lives were taken, and we've seen a swift response from General Sisi, much as we saw a swift response from King Abdullah in Jordan. These responses were anticipated, of course, by ISIS and welcomed, because they're speaking to a very small segment of the Islamic world. that they want to, that is inclined to be radicalized and which they hope to radicalize further. Their numbers have been swelling by the thousands every month, and there's no reason to suppose that that is going to be discontinued in the foreseeable future. So this is part of the reality that we're facing, and so some of the challenges that are going to be faced by Egypt, Jordan, and other countries that have significant Christian communities, such as Lebanon, in the future, ISIS is not going away.
It's very frightening, and it's certainly cause for prayer for our Christian brothers and sisters. Andrew Doran, Vice President, co-founder of In Defense of Christians, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
And now some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. 2 suspected accomplices of the slain gunman behind the deadly attacks in Copenhagen over the weekend are jailed tonight. The investigation is ongoing, but Denmark's prime minister says, so far, there are no signs of links to a wider terror network. Our chief White House correspondent, Susanne LaFrankie, is here with more on the story.
Well, Brian, the U.S. State Department is condemning the terrorist attacks. Police now suspect that the dead gunman may have become radicalized in prison. Denmark has been targeted since the newspaper published satirical cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad in 2005. But this is the country's first fatal terror attack in 30 years. Danes struggle to comprehend the senseless terror as they mourn the victims and their country's lost innocence.
Shocked that anger.
The gunman fired multiple shots Saturday through the window of a Copenhagen cafe during a free speech debate, killing one man. Hours later, police say Omar Abdel Hamid El Hassan shot a Jewish security guard in the head outside a synagogue. 5 police officers were also wounded in the attacks. Investigators say the 22-year-old was a convicted criminal released from prison just 2 weeks ago. Police suspect he might have been inspired by the Paris terror attacks. But Denmark's prime minister says so far there are no signs of links to a wider terror network.
This is not a conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims. This is a conflict between the core values of our society and violent extremists.
Police believe the target was Swedish cartoonist Lars Vilks, who's faced death threats for depicting the Prophet Muhammad as a dog. Flags flew at half-staff as the country prepares to hold memorials for the victims. The Israeli prime minister says the wave of anti-Semitic attacks will continue and is calling for Jews to come home to Israel. A leader in Denmark's Jewish community says he does not expect Danish Jews to leave their home.
We are Danish citizens. We want to live in Denmark, but since we're Jewish, there seems to be a security issue that we have to take care of.
The president is on his way back from a long weekend of golf in Southern California. Tomorrow, Mr. Obama will host a White House summit on countering violent extremism. Congress is not in session this week. Many are anxious for the congressional leaders and the White House to agree on a plan to fight terrorism. Brian.
Thanks, Suzanne. And Georgetown University's Father Dennis McManus is the U.S. Catholic Bishop's consultant for Jewish affairs. We see that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, is calling for Jews to come to Israel, but there's pushback. Why do you think Jewish leaders are pushing back on that?
I think, Brian, there's 3 questions floating in the air between Europe and Israel about this whole thing, and it's hard to pull them apart. Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying to Jews, if you do not feel safe in Europe, just as in the Holocaust, Israel is your home. You should come home from the diaspora and be Jews in Israel. And I would think that many Jews who feel the insecurity of attack in France, for example, last year 7,000 French Jews left France for other places, that really hits a note. But you hear the pushback from Danish Jews and others saying, wait. Israel is not founded on being a refuge for anti-Semitism. Israel is founded on Zionism. It's founded on the right of Jews for self-determination. Please, Mr. Netanyahu, don't turn Israel into something it was never meant to be.
Father, this seems to be a religious conflict between the Muslim world and probably the Jewish world here. How is Europe, which is so secular now, dealing with this?
Well, I think that's where the third question is. You heard Prime Minister Schmidt from Copenhagen. You hear French President Hollande saying, wait, this isn't about religion at its core. It's about whether great Western liberal democracies have room for everybody. And we will not tolerate discrimination, whether it's race, religion, gender, politics. Discrimination to us is discrimination. It's not a question of religion. It's a question of human rights. So you have this kind of post-Enlightenment, strong European liberal democracy saying it isn't religion, it's human rights.
Interesting dilemma. The advisor to the U.S. Catholic bishops on Jewish affairs, Father Dennis McManus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And intense fighting persists between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed separatists today. This is threatening that recent ceasefire deal. 5 Ukrainian troops have died, 25 have been wounded in the past day of artillery fire. Heavy weapons are supposed to start withdrawing from the front line tomorrow under the ceasefire agreement. It was brokered by the leaders of Germany and France. Ukraine's military spokesman says they're not ready to withdraw, he says, because 112 incidents of shelling is not a ceasefire. The 10-month conflict has now taken more than 5,300 lives. Boko Haram is threatening Niger and Chad, claiming to have fighters ready to carry out suicide bombings. The new threat comes as neighboring countries are plotting a joint military offensive against Boko Haram in Nigeria. Cameroon and Chadian troops have been fighting the militants in northern Cameroon border towns. The terrorists destroyed mosques and churches in Cameroon earlier this month. Nearly 100 people were killed, about 500 wounded in those attacks. Nigeria and its 4 bordering countries plan to deploy about 8,000 troops, hoping to combat the growing Boko Haram threat. Schools that had been closed for 6 months during the Ebola epidemic in Liberia are finally open again. Students had their temperatures taken before entering the school gates. Some had to wash their hands in chlorinated water. Many students say they were tired of sitting at home. Others say they're very fearful about going back to school. Liberia has seen 3,800 Ebola deaths. That is the highest of any country. Boston Cardinal Sean O'Malley says the clergy sex scandal has, quote, seriously diminished the church's credibility. He heads the commission appointed by Pope Francis to address it. Proposals to hold accountable and punish bishops and religious superiors who cover up abuse are being drafted and will be presented to the Pope. O'Malley says the church must humbly make the commitment to accountability, transparency, and zero tolerance. Forecasters expect wintry weather to reach into the deep south as New England digs out from its 4th winter storm in a month. Gusty winds created near whiteout conditions on Sunday in New England and much of the Northeast. A wide swath of the nation is freezing with below zero temperatures. The cold air and moisture are combining, spreading snow from the Midwest eastward. Coming up, 20 men return home to their flocks as cardinals after this weekend's Vatican ceremony. And we learn about the strong faith of Kayla Mueller, the 26-year-old humanitarian aid worker captured by ISIS and killed. Thank you so much for joining us on this President's Day, a Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Pope Francis welcomes 20 new cardinals into the Catholic Church with a meditation on Christian love. The Pope's homily Saturday focused on St. Paul's well-known passage from 1 Corinthians about love. It begins, love is patient, love is kind.
Quella cardinalizia è certamente una dignità, ma non è onorifica.
The Holy Father reminding his newest collaborators that being a cardinal isn't a prize, but a way to serve the Church in humility and tenderness. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI attended the ceremony. Francis embraced him at the beginning and the end of the service. This is Francis's 2nd class of cardinals. Once again, he looked to the peripheries to give a more universal representation to the College of Cardinals. Some cardinals expressed hope that their new roles would help them address social issues and reforms.
For the church, be more responsibility and to work more for the people of Myanmar, especially for real democracy and for development, peace and reconciliation, for the Myanmar people. Thank you, thank you.
For myself, coming from the Pacific, where these issues are happening, that I can be able to bring those issues for the awareness of His Holy Father, because it's a big issue now in terms of global warming.
Cardinals advise the Pope, but their primary purpose is to elect a new Pope when the time comes. Only those under the age of 80 can vote in a conclave. With Saturday's additions, that number now stands at 125. And Pope Francis receives royalty in the Vatican in celebration of Tonga's first cardinal. The Holy Father held an audience with the King and Queen of Tonga today. The King, who's a Methodist, expressed the enthusiasm of that tiny Pacific island nation over the election of its first cardinal. A majority of the islanders are Protestant. The King and Queen discussed issues affecting their nation with Francis, including those environmental concerns that the cardinal mentioned. Former Florida Governor Jeb Bush defends his effort to intervene in the death of a woman on life support nearly 10 years ago. Terry Schiavo's husband has written a scathing letter to the editor of the Miami Herald. Michael Schiavo insists his wife did not want to be kept alive artificially, and he thinks Bush owes an apology to him and the public. Bush, a Catholic, sided with Terry Schiavo's parents in the end-of-life dispute and says he doesn't regret doing so. Bush recently released emails from his time as Florida's governor. Many deal with the Schiavo case. He's considered a possible candidate for president. Friends and supporters hold a candlelight vigil for Kayla Mueller, the aid worker held hostage by ISIS, whose death was confirmed last week. The weekend vigil was sponsored by Northern Arizona University. That's Kayla's alma mater. The 26-year-old was involved in a Christian ministry as an undergraduate and was providing humanitarian aid when she was captured. Students who knew Kayla said she chose action over apathy. The vigil was described as an uplifting gathering of several hundred people that will inspire people of faith to get involved, just as Kayla did. Carol Thompson is joining us from Arizona, a professor of political economy at Northern Arizona University. She knows Kayla Mueller very well and worked with her on peacemaking initiatives. You called Kayla an ecumenical peacemaker. Describe what you mean by that.
Kayla not only wanted to have peace in the world, she worked for it. And one of the issues we worked on were receiving veterans back to Northern Arizona University in about 2009. We worked with a group of 20 organizations to make sure the veterans would have some way to integrate in the community and at the university. Kayla was a peacemaker, welcoming veterans back to the community.
Over the weekend and for the past several days, we've had more terrible news of terrorism. You're working with a support system there in Flagstaff for her family. How is this being taken?
The family very much feels every single killing because it's the opposite of Kayla. So the deaths of the 3 in North Carolina, in Libya, in Denmark, hit the family very closely. It's like losing another Kayla because they know these are innocent people being killed for revenge. And it's the opposite of what Kayla lived for.
Kayla wrote a beautiful letter to her family and others, and now it's been released. And she refers in here a lot to suffering, but it seems like every time she talks about suffering, she's focused on someone else's suffering, not her own. Is that what you know of Kayla?
Absolutely. She wrote that letter when she's in prison. We assume she's been brutalized. Well, prison is brutal. And she's worried about her parents and other people. And that is a peacemaker. You take risks and in order to try to be with the least of those, and that's Kayla.
She talked about surrendering herself to God and said that by your prayers, I have felt tenderly cradled in this free fall. That has to hurt when you read that, having known her.
Yes, and that is a phrase from her letter that her parents are using for how they feel right now, and that we are cradled tenderly in a free fall. And it's such beautiful poetic of expression of the utter despair and grief, but tenderly cradled.
She also wrote, please be patient, give your pain to God. Do you think that's what her family is doing now?
I know that's what her family is doing now. It's the only way they could continue to breathe and live. They have created, on its reference to the letter, Kayla's Hands, an organization, a foundation to remember Kayla, and that foundation is already making linkages to North Carolina for the families of the 3 killed, the 3.
Well, we'll pass that information across to our viewers, and we thank you for joining us. Carol Thompson, a political economy professor at Northern Arizona University. We appreciate you sharing your personal relationship with Kayla Mueller.
Thank you very much.
Up next, a bitter cold birthday celebration for our first president at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. And Mardi Gras parties already in full swing around the world before Lent begins on Wednesday. George Washington's birthday is celebrated on this third Monday of February. We now call it President's Day. It's really a day now to remember all of our presidents, not just Washington and Lincoln. The federal holiday usually falls between their birthdays in February. Thanks for joining us on this Monday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. Frigid temperatures greeted thousands paying tribute today to our first president at his Virginia homestead. Wyatt Goolsby was there at George Washington's Mount Vernon home, where visitors joined in a special observance.
In honor of his 283rd birthday, members of the U.S. military place a wreath inside George Washington's tomb in Virginia, a sign of respect for a man who set the standard for the American president. At his Mount Vernon home, visitors were treated to patriotic music and military performances. Today, President's Day, is Mount Vernon's single busiest day of the year. The estate hosts thousands who tour the grounds and participate in programs all aimed at taking visitors back to the late 18th century.
It's very important for us to create that sense of authenticity, that sense of place, to really give people a sense of what it was like in early America, the world that Washington lived in.
That means close attention to detail, whether it's the buildings and shops or the actors in period costumes.
The characters walking around the ground tell stories that would have been current to his time. If you try to bring them into our world, they try to push you back and remind you that they are living in 1799, and what you know today may be very different from what they know.
No better example of that than General Washington himself, who refused to break character even when I asked him about his birthday.
How old are you going to be now?
Well, I'm well into my 60s, sir. How old are you?
Well, luckily I'm just 30, so I'm not quite there yet.
I have boots older than you.
The general even opened up about his childhood.
We've been hearing this rumor that you chopped down a cherry tree.
It never happened. It's a myth. There is a fellow who wrote a story about me, and he doesn't know a lick about my childhood. And so he made up this story. But he was trying to teach a story, and I do believe that honesty is the best policy.
And for all the people who celebrate George Washington, it's good to know the first president was always honest and respectful to visitors at his home, virtues that Americans still hold dear to this day.
I guess we bow since we're in Virginia.
We bow, sir.
In Virginia, Wyatt Goolsby, EWTN News Nightly.
Classic Goolsby there. Thank you, Wyatt. The Vatican's barber shop for the homeless is now open. Men and women lined up outside the public restrooms off St. Peter's Square for a shower and free haircut today. The haircuts are available only on Mondays. That's when Rome's barber shops are closed, so the barbers can volunteer their time. Showers for the homeless pilgrims have been made available for the past month. Each receives a kit that includes towels, soap, and toothpaste and other things. Basic hygiene most of us take for granted is a real treat when you live on the street.
I cut my hair, took a shower, beard, everything. It's wonderful.
The showers are open every day except Wednesday, when Pope Francis holds his weekly general audience in St. Peter's Square. We'll call it Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday. The celebrations are beginning across the globe ahead of Ash Wednesday later this week. In Colombia, thousands of performers don traditional costumes for a folklore parade. They dance and twirl and jump while musicians play along the parade avenue. Many are dressed in red, yellow, and blue, the colors of the Colombian flag. In Germany, locals fill the streets of Cologne and Dusseldorf for one of the best-known carnival parades. Floats include everything from popular cartoon characters to more serious themes referencing recent terror attacks. The partying leads up to Ash Wednesday, marking the beginning of Lent. Well, thanks for joining us until tomorrow. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, watch again on YouTube. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. As we say goodnight, we revisit this weekend's creation of new cardinals at St. Peter's Basilica.